Julian Fisher had never wanted to be a hero. He was, by nature, a man of precision, of numbers, equations, and absolute control. There was a certain comfort in that, a tranquility to knowing that if he could just focus hard enough, every problem had a solution. But that comfort had long since evaporated. And now, as the streets of New York buckled under the weight of a strange, invisible force, Julian found himself staring at a disaster of his own making. It all began with a simple experiment. Julian had been working on a theoretical model, one that could bend gravitational fields in ways humanity had only dreamed about. The theory was sound. The tests, at first, went as planned. And then, it happened. A miscalculation. A tiny error in the calculations. A shift in the force that should have been impossible. Gravity, it seemed, was no longer something humans could predict or control. In the middle of Manhattan, skyscrapers suddenly started rising into the sky. Cars were yanked off the roads, spinning like toys caught in a cyclone. Pedestrians screamed, stumbling as the ground beneath them buckled and twisted. The very laws of nature were being shredded. Not again, Julian muttered, his face pale with the realization that his attempts to correct the anomaly were going to be much harder than he had anticipated. He was standing in the middle of the chaos now, still wearing the lab coat he'd never bothered to take off. His hands were shaking slightly, but he clenched them into fists. He couldn't afford to panic, not now. Not when the city was literally falling apart around him, the world had turned upside down, and only Julian had the power to fix it. The power, ironically, to manipulate gravity. Okay, think, Julian muttered to himself, scanning the swirling devastation. His gravity-manipulating device, a small, sleek orb attached to his wrist, was the only tool he had left. But the gravity field was so volatile now that he could barely stabilize himself. He would need to focus all of his energy into just one thing, fixing the rift he had caused. As he concentrated, he felt it, a pulse of energy coursing through him. The device on his wrist hummed with the faintest whir. Time seemed to slow as he bent the gravity field around him, trying to pull the buildings back into place. It was working, he thought. The skyline was beginning to settle, the buildings returning to their upright position. The chaos was subsiding, but then, crack. The sound was like thunder. The air rippled in waves, and suddenly, Julian felt something shift within him. Something unnatural. He stumbled, his mind reeling, unable to keep up with the sudden influx of energy. For a brief, terrifying moment, he lost all sense of where he was. One moment, he was in the city, holding the gravity field in place. The next, he was no longer in the present at all. The streets of New York faded from view, and Julian found himself standing alone in a vast, empty void. The ground, if it could even be called that, was a swirling blur of abstract shapes, like the universe itself had forgotten how to hold together time. That was what was wrong. He wasn't in the present anymore. He wasn't even in the past. Julian had slipped out of time itself. The sudden realization hit him with full force. He wasn't just manipulating gravity anymore. He had become part of it. Julian gasped for air, though there was no need to breathe here. It was as though the concept of physical existence had stopped making sense altogether. He had no body, just a consciousness, floating in a sea of shifting time. "What is this?" he whispered. The voice that responded was not his own. "Time is a river, Julian. But now, you are the current," it said. The voice was calm, ethereal, but undeniably ancient. The words swirled around him like smoke, intangible yet unyielding. Who are you?" Julian demanded, his voice louder now, trying to grasp some semblance of control in the madness. "You already know me. You just can't remember yet," the voice answered, its tone filled with a strange, knowing sympathy. "But you will, in time." He didn't understand. But in a way, he did. His mind was fragmented, but there was a certainty growing inside him, something he had never experienced before. He was more than human now. More than just a scientist. He had become an infinite part of the universe's design, but that didn't mean he had lost everything. No, Julian whispered to himself, blinking back the strange sensation that threatened to overwhelm him. I'm not done. I have to fix this. I have to go back. It took only a moment for Julian to realize that the more he tried to focus, the more distant the present became. It was as though each thought he had sent him further and further into this space. He was losing himself, not to death, but to something far worse, to becoming the very thing he sought to control. That he stretched out his mind, pulling at the threads of time, trying to force the past and the future into a shape he could understand. He reached for the device on his wrist, but it was gone. In its place, he found only the raw, untamed power of gravity. He could feel it, as if it were woven into the very fabric of the universe. His fingers twitched. He wasn't sure if he was moving his body anymore, but something told him that if he concentrated, he could change the course of history itself. That's when the images began to appear. Snapshots of moments, fragments of time, snippets of his life and others' lives flashing before his eyes. Julian saw himself, years ago, sitting in a laboratory, scribbling notes in a feverish hurry. He saw the first time he tested the gravity manipulation device. He saw the city, his city, before the disaster had struck, and then he saw the future. A future in which he had successfully repaired the anomaly, only to witness the world growing darker. The power he'd wielded, in his attempt to control gravity, had caused ripples that would echo across time, sending shockwaves of chaos into every corner of reality. People who were never meant to rise to power did so. Events that should have remained buried came to the surface. Julian's manipulation of the laws of gravity had torn the world apart in ways he could never have foreseen. The future Julian watched was a dystopia, one where the very people he had tried to save had been crushed under the weight of his own mistakes. No, he whispered, his voice hollow. This can't be the answer. The voice returned, this time louder, more insistent. You are the answer, Julian. You are the bridge between the past and the future. But you are not just a man anymore. You are the force that drives time itself. His mind raced. This is too much. I can't handle it. I need to go back. Fix this. Find a way out of this, whatever this is. But as Julian reached for the threads of time once more, he felt a pull, a deep, gravitational tug from somewhere far off. A force stronger than anything he had ever known. He was being drawn forward into something, someone, from a future that had yet to come. Before he could even react, Julian was swept into the current of time, his entire being consumed by the cosmic pull. He had no control, no way to stop it. His consciousness stretched across the fabric of time, faster and faster, until, when Julian's consciousness snapped back into focus, there was no sense of time. The world around him was silent, unnaturally so. The usual hum of life, the background noise of existence, had disappeared. He could feel gravity, though. It was there, as constant as ever, pulling at him, holding him in place. But something had changed. He had changed, but he was still not in the present. In fact, he couldn't tell where he was at all. The surroundings were dim, blurry, fuzzy, like a dream half forgotten. The air was thick, pulsing with a strange energy, and his own body seemed almost foreign, as if he no longer fully inhabited it. The usual sensations, the weight of his body, the pressure of his feet on the ground, were absent. He was drifting, weightless, as though he were both everywhere and nowhere at once. "Where am I?" he asked aloud, though his voice felt disconnected from his body. It was a thought more than an utterance, as if his words themselves were being pulled from him by some external force. The voice that answered him seemed to come from nowhere, a whisper carried by the very air itself. "You are between worlds, Julian," the voice said, familiar in a way he couldn't place. It wasn't the same voice from before, calm and distant, like a universal hum. This one felt different. It had weight to it. It was as if it had always been there, waiting to be heard. You have crossed the threshold. He had no reply to that. No understanding. All he knew was that something in him, the very essence of who he was, had shifted. He wasn't just a man anymore. Not just a scientist who had meddled with forces beyond comprehension. He was something more, something that had transcended humanity. I didn't mean to do this, he said quietly, though he wasn't even sure if anyone was listening. There was no one here, no physical being to speak to, no one to reach out to. Only the pulsing void around him. The words seemed to fall away, lost in the infinite space of this place. You never meant to, but your purpose has always been written in the stars. The force you control is not just a power, it is the very nature of existence. You are bound to it now. And time is your domain. The voice grew softer, its tone reverberating in his bones. But you are not alone, Julian. The air shifted, and Julian felt something stir in the distance. It was faint at first, but as it drew closer, the shape began to solidify. A figure emerged from the blurry haze, a silhouette formed from shadows and light. A woman, tall, her features strikingly familiar, though he had never seen her before. She looked at him, and though there was no expression on her face, Julian felt as though she was peering into the very heart of him. Her presence was both comforting and terrifying, like an old memory that refused to stay buried. Her eyes glowed faintly, with the kind of knowing that could only come from someone who had seen the end of things, and the beginning. You, Julian whispered, his mind racing. I know you. The woman didn't speak, but Julian could feel her presence, her energy. It was like she had been waiting for him, waiting for this moment when he, too, would cross over. She stepped forward, her movements graceful, yet purposeful. You've been to this place before, Julian. Though you don't remember it, she said, her voice now clearer, more distinct. There was no hint of doubt in her words, no hesitation. As if she had always known what he would say, what he would do. You will remember soon enough. Who are you? Julian asked, his mind still struggling to grasp what was happening. What do you want from me? Want? I don't want anything from you. I'm here to guide you. She tilted her head slightly. Though, in some ways, you already know the way. Your power, your manipulation of gravity, it has always been a part of this. You just didn't realize how deeply you were connected to it. Her words sank in slowly, and Julian felt a shiver run through him. He didn't understand it, none of it made sense. But there was something in the way she spoke, something in the certainty of her words, that made him want to believe her. You're the future, he murmured, staring at her. It wasn't a question. He already knew the answer, the woman nodded. Yes. And no. I am the manifestation of what could be, what should be, if time flows as it's meant to. But I am also a warning. A reflection of what happens when time is tampered with too much. I didn't mean to break it, Julian said, his voice strained with frustration. I just wanted to fix it. To fix the mess I made. But it's all slipping away. I don't know how to control it anymore. She regarded him with a quiet sadness, as if seeing the battle within him, the internal struggle between the man he had been and the force he had become. You cannot control it, she said gently. That is the mistake you've made, Julian. Time cannot be controlled. It must be allowed to flow freely. You have meddled with it, and now you must face the consequences. But I can't just leave it like this. I can't just, he stopped himself, realizing the futility of his words. There was no going back. No simple solution to what he had done. The woman stepped closer. No. You cannot undo what has been done. But you can reshape it. You can guide it. You can be part of the solution. But first, you must understand what you are becoming. I don't know what that means, Julian admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. You will. She smiled faintly, her eyes softening as she regarded him. But first, you must see the future. With a single motion, she reached out, her hand hovering just above his chest. A pulse of energy, stronger than anything Julian had ever felt, rippled through him. The world around him flickered and began to shift, colors and shapes warping, bending in ways that defied all logic. And then, he saw it, the future. It was a future where the world he knew had crumbled, but not in the way he'd feared. It was not an apocalypse born of destruction, but a subtle unraveling, a reality where the very fabric of existence had begun to warp under the weight of his actions. Julian saw himself, older now, a specter drifting through the ruins of the world he had tried to save. He saw cities in disarray, people living in fear, not because of the disasters he had tried to avert, but because time itself had turned against them. There was no war, no catastrophic event. Just a slow, insidious erosion of everything they knew, everything they trusted. Time, once a constant, had become unpredictable, erratic. People no longer knew what to expect, how to live, when to act. They had lost all sense of the natural order. And Julian saw the truth then. His intervention had caused the unraveling. His efforts to fix the anomaly had only caused greater instability. He had taken the one thing that should have been sacred, time, and torn it apart. He gasped, staggering back. "I did this," he whispered. "Yes," the woman said softly. "But you can undo it. You can repair what you have broken. Not by controlling time, but by allowing it to restore itself." Julian struggled to find his words, his mind still reeling from the vision. "How?" She reached out again, her touch gentle, but firm. "You will become part of the force that holds the universe together. You will not be a man anymore, Julian. You will be the current that runs through the river of time. You will be the gravity that pulls everything back into balance. The past, the present, the future, they are not separate, not anymore. You are all of them." He could feel it then, something deep inside him. A pull. Not physical, but metaphysical. He was no longer just Julian Fisher. He was becoming something greater, something that had always existed in the background of the universe, hidden from view. He was becoming gravity itself. "You are eternal now," the woman said. "And with that eternity comes a responsibility. You are the force that guides the timeline, Julian. Not to control it, but to allow it to flow as it was meant to. It's not about fixing time, it's about letting it be." And in that moment, Julian understood. He could never go back to who he was. He had transcended his own limitations. He was no longer just a man. He was the force that moved through the world, the gravity that kept everything in place. And though it was terrifying, it was also exhilarating. He was part of something larger, something infinite. "You are ready now," the woman said, her voice fading as she stepped back into the shadows. "Go. Restore balance." And with that, Julian Fisher, no longer just a man, began his journey as the eternal force that would guide the universe back to its natural order. Julian felt the change happen, but it wasn't something he could articulate in words. The idea of becoming a force, a thing that transcended time and space, was unfathomable, yet as he embraced it, it made a strange kind of sense. Everything clicked together, but not in a way that gave him clarity. Instead, it was like he had become part of a puzzle where he didn't know what the pieces looked like, but somehow he knew he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He reached out instinctively, a movement that should have been natural. But there was no arm to reach out with. There was no body. His mind expanded, like a ripple in a pond, and then he was everywhere. He was not just in the universe, he was the universe. The concept of time was no longer something he could keep track of. It was a blur of past, present, and future, all wrapped together in an endless loop of possibility. He could feel it, swirling around him, wrapping him in its infinite strands. It was beautiful in a way that terrified him. He wasn't just witnessing time anymore, he was part of it. He was the very thing that bound everything together. Gravity. Time. The fabric of existence itself, yet, it wasn't enough. The universe had a rhythm to it, a pulse that he could sense now that he was no longer confined to the limitations of human perception. But that rhythm was off. There was a discord, a sharp, jagged edge cutting through the flow of time. A fracture, a tear in the cosmic fabric, one that he had caused by trying to fix the anomalies that had started it all. Julian could see it, like a shadow over the landscape of existence, a break in the natural order, where things were not where they were supposed to be. The past was colliding with the future, and both were struggling against the pull of the present. The future had started to bleed into the past, creating a loop, an endless cycle that twisted back upon itself. People who had not yet been born were remembering the dead, and the dead were living memories of people who had yet to make their mark. Time was unraveling, losing its boundaries, and Julian, now a part of it, could feel the weight of the cosmic mistake he had made. He tried to reach out, to make sense of it, but every attempt to touch the thread of reality felt like pulling at smoke. The future and the past collided, and with it, he felt the fragility of existence. If the balance wasn't restored, it would all come apart, everything would fold into itself, and there would be no past, no future, no present. Only an endless loop of nothing. But he wasn't helpless. Not anymore. He could feel it, deep inside him, a surge of energy that rose from the core of the universe itself. A pull, a direction. He wasn't just a part of the timeline now, he was its force. He could bend it. He could reshape it. He could realign the flow of time, but he had to do it carefully. He had to remember that time wasn't something to be controlled, it was something to be guided, something to be allowed to return to its natural course. Julian focused on the tear, trying to ease it, to restore the flow. He reached into the swirling fabric of existence, pulling at the strands of time. It wasn't easy. There was resistance, a force that fought back against his touch, as if the universe itself was pushing him away. But Julian, no longer a man, but something far beyond that, was determined that I can't fix everything. I can only guide it. The thought came to him as a whisper, a reminder from some place deep within. The universe shifted. The tear began to close, but not completely. The ripples continued to spread, but the strain lessened. The timeline, now more pliable under his touch, started to bend back into its proper place. Things that had been displaced slowly began to right themselves. The events that had spiraled out of control began to line up, one by one, like the pieces of a broken glass that were slowly being reassembled. But it was not enough. The universe was still fractured in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. His actions had done more than just change time, they had altered the very fabric of the multiverse. The ripple effect of his mistakes was still there, lingering like a shadow, waiting to burst forth again if he wasn't careful. The voice returned. You cannot save everything, Julian. Some things are meant to break. Julian faltered at that. The words sent a chill through what remained of his consciousness. What do you mean? What do I have to let go of? The past. The future. The things you cannot control. You will see it, in time. He resisted the pull of the voice. No. I can fix this. I have to. No. You can guide it. But you cannot fix everything. It was an impossible realization. A sobering one. Julian had never understood what it meant to let go. To trust. He had always been the one to fix things, to control, to set things right. But the voice, whoever or whatever it was right. There was no perfect fix. Not for this. Not for what he had done. Time was not something to be controlled. It was something that had to be allowed to move, to flow freely. He could nudge it, guide it, but he could never dominate it. The friction of resistance faded, and Julian felt something else. A calm. A clarity. He could feel the timeline begin to smooth out. Not perfectly, but enough. Enough to know that his actions, while they had caused harm, were also part of the larger pattern. Everything had a place, even his mistakes. His interference had set off a chain of events, but the chain was now complete. The universe had begun to heal itself. The woman appeared again. Julian didn't have to see her face to know it was her. Her presence was like a beacon, a constant, reminding him of everything he had learned. She looked at him, and in her eyes, there was no judgment. Only understanding. "You did what you could," she said softly, her voice filled with the same quiet certainty as before. "Now, you must let it be." He nodded, the weight of the universe pressing lightly against him. He wasn't human anymore. He had transcended. But he hadn't lost everything. He had gained something else, the wisdom to know that not everything could be fixed. Not everything could be saved. Some things had to be left to unfold as they would. "You will be the force now," she said. "The current that runs through the river of time. You will guide it, but not control it. Your journey is far from over, Julian. But you are no longer alone." He didn't speak. There were no words for what he felt. He was everything and nothing at once. A presence in the fabric of time, shifting, moving, guiding. Not controlling, not fixing, but simply being. And as the last of the tension in the universe eased, Julian found himself standing on the edge of the great river of time. The past, the present, and the future rippled before him. He could feel them, each moment in perfect alignment. Everything, for the first time, felt right. Not perfect. But right. With a final breath, or perhaps it was a thought, Julian Fisher allowed himself to drift. He was no longer just Julian. He was time itself. And in that vast, eternal moment, he knew that whatever came next, he would be there to guide it, and time, eternal, unyielding, and free, flowed onward.